Hello everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, in honor of the season changing, and just like the general excitement I have for the fall time, I thought we would do a fall book recommendations video, as well as a combination of a TBR of some books I'm also planning on reading for this fall. I have the books broken up into a couple different genre categories, which I obviously will have linked down below. So with that intro out of the way, let's get right into the video. Starting off, we are going to be talking about probably one of the best genres to read during the fall, and that is fantasy. I'm going to start off by talking about more general fantasy, and then I'll get into a pretty niche subcategory. But starting off with general fantasy, the first book I want to talk about is probably the best one I would recommend for fall specifically, and that is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is a YA fantasy book that follows our main character Isabel, who is a painter whose primary clientele are members of Fae nobility. When she gets an opportunity of painting a portrait for the Fae Prince of Autumn, she ends up painting a human emotion into his expression, which to him is seen as a great offense, and he ends up taking Isabel to stand trial in his autumn court as a punishment for her transgression. However, the book is much more an adventure story of the two of them traveling together, starting to bond and fall in love, and kind of bridge the divide between humans and Fae. This book, in my opinion, is like the fall fantasy book. The descriptions of the Fae autumn lands are exactly what someone would picture when they're like romanticizing everything about fall, like the beauty of the leaves changing color, the crisp, bright fall air, all of the beauty that comes with the seasons changing, and all of the like wonder and magic that comes in the potential of a new season. The atmosphere in this book is just top notch, and definitely the aspect of the book that really shines in. Margaret Rogerson also is just a really great writer. I feel like everything she put into the plot of this book is really relevant when it comes to like the final climax, and overall just makes for a really satisfying and enjoyable read. This is also her debut, which is honestly shocking to me considering how well it's written. I feel like if there's any book you're going to take as a recommendation from this video, this is definitely it. The next book I wanted to talk about is Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a Greek mythology retelling that is focusing on the character Circe from the Odyssey, who originally is this kind of side character, just another obstacle for Odysseus to go through in his journey to get home. But this book obviously is a feminist retelling that recenters the character of Circe and kind of weaves in a couple different myths to create her backstory. In some ways, it's also a retelling and kind of a creation of the Telegony, which is the lost third part of the epic Greek cycle that included the Iliad and the Odyssey, which focuses on Circe's son Telegonus. Again, in terms of books that have beautiful writing and just amazing imagery, you definitely can't go wrong reading a Madeline Miller book. This book is incredibly beautiful, and I feel like it's also perfect for the sort of like magical, dark cottagecore energy it has, specifically in the section when Circe first arrives on the island of Aiaia. We see Circe through a lot of different seasons of her life, but I feel like that section in particular really just like has a very strong autumn, fall energy to it. Okay, now talking about a more like TBR book in this general fantasy category, we have A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. This book I've heard is very similar in energy to Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, definitely having a lot of that like magical academia vibes, and also was kind of like cozy fantasy before cozy fantasy became as big as it is now, because this book was originally published in 2013. This book is the start of a series following this main character, Lady Trent, who is a researcher that studies dragons. I don't actually know a lot more in terms of like the plot of this book, but I feel like all those things going into it make me really intrigued to pick this one up. Okay, now I wanted to talk about a subcategory of fantasy that kind of mixes with other genres, and that is the category of kind of like vampire lit fic. Obviously within fall you move closer and closer to like the more spooky season, so reading more like horror adjacent vampire books feels pretty appropriate. The first one in this category I'd love to recommend is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This seems like such a no-brainer to include in this list. This book follows our main character, Louis Dupoint-du-Lac, as he tells his life story to an unnamed narrator from the point just before he was turned, how he caught the attention of the mysterious vampire Lestat, and his life throughout the 17 and 1800s as he deals with questions of humanity, grief, religious trauma, and the nature of life and death. If you're in the mood for a more slow, introspective, gothic fantasy book, this is definitely the one to pick out. I really love the Vampire Chronicles. I've now read 4 books in this series, and Interview with the Vampire is definitely a little bit different tone-wise compared to some of the other ones, but I still really enjoyed my time reading it, and definitely a book that has a lot of depth in all of the themes that are discussed, that it makes it great for rereads in the future as well. Okay, another dark, gothic vampire book I would recommend is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This is like the perfect dark gothic romance that follows our main character Constanza, who in the opening paragraph is writing a letter to her now dead vampire husband, giving an explanation for why she killed him, and it then follows her story, her possession and control of her husband over her, but also the love and solace that she found in his two other brides and their stand against him. Like some of the other books I've mentioned, the writing in this book is so beautiful. S.T. Gibson in this book just has a great way of explaining things in metaphors that really get to the heart of the emotion of the scene. I feel like she tackles a lot of really interesting and important themes in this book as well, and overall I really did enjoy this book when I read it. I also think the narrator of the audiobook is really amazing in the different portrayals she does for all of the characters, so I would highly recommend checking out the audiobook versions of this book if you can get them as well. Okay, now we're going to move into my TBR for this subcategory. This is definitely a category that I'm going to be focusing on a lot come this autumn season. And I might be doing a reading vlog in the future focusing on a couple of these books that I tentatively have named my sexy lesbian vampire reading vlog. To be honest, I think only 3 of the books I'm going to mention here are sapphic, but they kind of all have a general similar vibe, primarily focusing on female vampires. Besides those things, I don't actually know a ton about the specific plots of these books, so I'm just going to talk about them very quickly. The first one is The God of Endings by Jacqueline Holland. This one has been on my list for a while, and I do believe the main character might not be necessarily a vampire, but just some other type of immortal woman. Next one is Woman Eating by Claire Coda. This is another one where I don't know if she's actually a vampire. She might be some other type of immortal being / demon, but I'm pretty sure she does drink blood to live, and it deals with other themes of food scarcity and eating disorders in connection with that pursuit of blood. The next one is In the Roses of Pieria by Anna Burke. This one is one of the sapphic romances I'm going to be reading. The next one is Thirst by Marina Yuzuk. I probably butchered this person's last name. This is another lesbian vampire book that I believe is translated fiction. The next one we have is A Long Time Dead by Samara Breger. And the last one we have is Wheel of the Nightlife by Rachel Caller Croft. Okay, now that we are done with all of the fantasy books I want to talk about, let's move on to ones that are more specifically horror books. Some of these also do have some fantasy elements in them, but I would say that horror is their primary genre. The first one we have is Slewfoot by Brom. This is an adult horror book that follows a main character, Abatha, who after the death of her husband is desperate for any way to make it through this harvest season. And she ends up turning to this god of the forest named Samson to help her enact revenge against the Puritan village that has scorned her. This is definitely a good book to read right at the start of fall, because in the book it takes place primarily right before the harvest season. This book actually isn't one of my personal favorite horror books. There's things in the plot that I particularly didn't resonate with, but a lot of my friends who have read this book really enjoy it, and it's quite beloved on BookTube. This book is also a rare one where I feel like both the physical book and the audiobook have very different things they offer. With the physical book, Brom is also an illustrator, so a lot of the characters and creatures that we meet in this book have illustrations that are done by him in the physical book, whereas in the audiobook, I think the narrator does a really good job of playing the main character Abatha. And there's also a part when Abatha sings a song to Samson, and the narrator in the audiobook actually sings the song out loud, as opposed to just reading it in more of a poem format. And I feel like that really adds an immersive element in the audiobook that not all audiobook narrators will go the extra mile to do. So I think either format you end up reading this book in, you're guaranteed to have a good time. The next book I wanted to talk about is Bunny by Mona Awad. This book has a lot of quirky / dark comedy elements to it, and it's a mix of horror and dark academia. It follows our main character, Samantha Mackey, who is in this prestigious college literary program, where it's just her and 4 other girls who call themselves the Bunnies. They are very much a clique that Samantha absolutely despises, but come their senior year, they invite Samantha to join them in one of their writing retreats, where a lot of other things are taking place besides just working on their poetry and creative writing. This is a book that really requires you to think and have an opinion, which I really love. I love reading Reddit discussion posts on this novel. My only problem with this book is I do think it has been kind of sensationalized, if that makes sense, in how many people really romanticize the bunnies as this ideal form of female friendship, when I feel like that's the same thing as romanticizing the Heathers or the Plastics. They are obviously supposed to be the villains. But that's definitely more of a community issue versus an issue with the book itself. I really enjoyed my time when I read this book, and my wife read it a couple months ago, and she didn't have the best time with it, but we did have a lot of really interesting discussions about plot points in the book afterwards. So I think love it or hate it, this book definitely elicits a lot of emotions in people, and it requires a lot of critical thinking afterward, which I really enjoy. Okay, the last book that I want to mention here is on my TBR, and that is The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. I don't know a ton about the plot of this book, but I do know that it is the basis for the AMC TV show The Mayfair Witches, and is the start of the Mayfair Witches trilogy. I think it's just a trilogy, there might be more books after that. From what I understand, this series, and this book in particular, follows a set of twins that are connected to the Mayfair family. However, they were adopted out as babies, and they don't actually know anything about their family history, but all of the members of the Mayfair family are connected to this demon named Lasher. And when they grow older and start exhibiting some of the signs of their powers, the demon Lasher is doing anything in his power to bring the two twins back into the family. That's, I think, what the plot of this book is. I definitely am interested in checking this out because of how much I love Anne Rice's writing style when I've read the Vampire Chronicles. And I do know that the Vampire Chronicles do have some crossovers with the Mayfair Witches series, with some of the characters kind of dipping into both of the series. So I'm very interested in starting this series and seeing what it's like. And if I like it, I will also probably watch the TV show adaptation. Okay, now let's move on to the genre of romance books. I actually don't have a lot of recommendations for this category. I know there's a ton of witchy rom-com romance books that have come out in the past couple years, but they're not really my subgenre, to be honest. Instead, I want to talk about a couple books on my TBR that are coming out this fall season. Both of these come out in October, so I figured they would be books that I'm definitely going to read as soon as they release. The first one is Sword Crossed by Freya Marske. This book comes out in October, and I already have it pre-ordered. This is Freya Marske's newest release after she finished up with the Last Binding trilogy, which is a series I've talked about a ton on my channel. This, I believe, is a standalone, and it follows a young man who needs to hire someone to be a swordsman as part of this, like, wedding tradition. And the guy he ends up hiring is actually a con man who is posing to be this, like, accomplished swordsman. And obviously, over the course of the book, they are going to start falling in love. I'm very interested in seeing what Freya Marske does with a much more, like, contained story, considering her debut was a series that was spread out over a trilogy. But I really like her writing style, so I'm very excited to see what this book ends up holding. Next romance I'm really excited to read this fall season is Sorcery and Small Magics by Maiga Ducey. This book comes out in October. I also have an e-arc of this book that I'm going to be reading ahead of time. Thank you so much to Orbit Books and NetGalley for providing me with an e-arc of this book. And this one contains a lot of things I really love in my fantasy romances. It's another historical fantasy romance that is a rivals to lovers that follows two guys who are bound together by a curse, and they need to venture into this enchanted forest in order to find the cure. A lot of, like, forest proximity, hopefully some good banter involved as well. This book, like I said before, comes out in October, but I'm probably going to be reading it ahead of time since I do have that arc. Okay, I'm going to mention very quickly one nonfiction book that is actually on my TBR, and that book is Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. A book about mushrooms just seems like the quintessential nonfiction book to read during the fall. I feel like many other basic bitches, I am very into mushrooms. I love mushrooms in decor. I'm glad that they've grown in popularity over the last couple years. I also watched the documentary Fantastic Fungi and was really moved by all of the, like, more fantastical and powerful elements of fungi as a part of our ecosystem. So I'd love to read a nonfiction book about them and sort of learn more about them in all of their forms. Okay, the next category I wanted to move on to is thrillers. This is another genre that, like horror, I feel like really lends itself to the fall time as we get more and more into the spooky atmosphere. The first book I want to talk about is probably less a thriller and more like general fiction / literary fiction, but it does have a lot of very strong fall-time elements to it, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This follows our main character, Richard Papin, who, upon transferring to his new college, is pulled into the elite world of the ancient Greek students in his class. This book is very much a whodunit, focusing on the death of one of Richard's classmates, and this is considered like the mother and like pillar of all dark academia books, because it really does focus on the darker side of academia, showing the brutality and the harm that can come from the pursuit of knowledge. I really love this book. One thing that I think a lot of people maybe downplay in their reviews of it, or maybe it's just me, but I feel like this book has a lot of like dark comedic elements to it as well. It very much reminds me of the movie Heathers in some of like the line deliveries of the characters and the way that they talk about all of the terrible things that have happened. But this book is so good. It's a classic and very hyped up for a good reason. I gave this book 5 stars when I read it last year, and it kind of also is on my TBR to read sometime this year as well. Okay, I'm going to talk now about some thrillers that are on my TBR. The first two, I honestly don't know how much fall vibes they actually give, but they're the only 2 thrillers that I own in my collection. and I thought for that reason the fall time is probably when I'm going to read them. The first one is The Lamplighters by Emma Stonks, or Emma Stonix. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce her last name. This is a very slow, atmospheric thriller that is about 3 lighthouse keepers that disappear, and then follows the 3 women connected to these lighthouse keepers in dealing with the wake of their absence. I believe this book is also possibly inspired by the Flannan Lighthouse disappearances, which, if you've ever watched BuzzFeed Unsolved, is a pretty famous cold case involving 3 lighthouse keepers disappearing. A weird, kind of niche interest of mine is that I love lighthouses, and I've always wanted to read more books that focus on them, so this is definitely one of the books I would love to add to my TBR for this fall. Also, this cover design is so incredibly beautiful. That was definitely one of the first things that drew me to this book, and I was able to find it secondhand, so I'm very glad I was able to get it. Okay, the other thriller that I own is His and Hers by Alice Feeney. This is going to be the 3rd Alice Feeney book that I've read. It's not even like she's that much of a favorite author. I just feel like her thrillers are very entertaining as much as they are very out there in some of their reveals. At the very least, I know they're probably going to be a good time. A lot of her thrillers are domestic thrillers, and I think this one is no exception. I believe it follows a ex-husband and wife, who I believe are brought together again because they are working on the same case of either a disappearance or a murder of a young woman, but both members of the ex-couple are hiding things about their past that obviously will come to light in relation to working together on this case. One reason why I'm very excited to read this book is because I really wanted to listen to the audiobook for it, since the male narrator is Richard Armitage, who is an actor. He's been in the Hobbit movies as well as Hannibal, and I'm pretty sure he's done a couple other Alice Feeney audiobooks as well. He usually always plays the husband character in her books. I really liked him as an actor in terms of the movies and TV shows I've seen him in, so I'm excited to see what he's like as a audiobook narrator. Actually, weirdly related to Richard Armitage, the last book I have added for my fall TBR in the thriller category is The Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. This book is the first in the Hannibal series that most people probably know from the book and film adaptations of The Silence of the Lambs. However, instead of following a main character, Clarice, this one follows the FBI agent Will Graham and his connection working with the now imprisoned serial killer Hannibal Lecter as they work together to solve the case of a serial killer called the Red Dragon. This book is a little bit more tentative on my TBR, since obviously I know there's a lot of things in this book that I probably won't like, both of it being probably a little bit outdated, as well as the fact that it's probably going to be a little bit gross, but I have watched all 3 seasons of the Hannibal TV show, and I really like that TV show, despite the fact that it does gross me out quite a bit. And I feel like it was kind of only a matter of time until I wanted to read the original source material, just as another way to get back into that world and think about those characters. So I am hoping I can read this book in the next couple months. So that is it for all of my fall book recommendations and upcoming TBR. I would love to know if there's any books that you guys are really hoping to read this fall season, or if you guys have any quintessential autumn atmospheric reads. Please consider dropping them in the comments down below. But that is going to be it for me today. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, or subscribing. Consider following me on the Storygraph as well as my Bookstagram, which is linked in the description. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!